it's I want to go through a few of the different stories that are emerging from the conflict. Seeing there's a massive missile strike of the Russian armed forces on different infrastructure assets in Ukraine. What is that? That's something that's just happened here. Can you tell us a little bit about what this looks like? What's going on here?
Yes, this has turned out to be the largest missile strike since the beginning of the war, which is interesting. Once again, it tends to put the lie to the notion that somehow or another the Russians are running out of missiles, running out of weapons, and so forth, which we've been hearing ever since the war began. It's all nonsense. These missiles were launched, not entirely, but largely from aircraft, mostly bombers that flew towards Ukraine from different directions and delivered these cruise missiles. At the same time, large numbers of what we call loitering munitions, drones, were also used in this attack. And virtually every major city from one end of Ukraine to the other, and remember, Ukraine's the size of Texas, was struck last night. We wanted to know what the targets were, but weren't able to really establish with any certainty until this morning, and it looks as though there was a concerted effort to strike all of the remaining energy production sites. In other words, anything that produces energy, specifically electricity, heat, those were all struck with amazing accuracy. Virtually everything got through because Ukrainian air defenses have been severely weakened over the last several months. And as a result, we see that railroads are virtually at a standstill. Now, this is very important from the standpoint of the Russians because it makes it very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to supply their forces in the field. If they can't use the railroads, they can't transport tanks, armored fighting vehicles coming in from the west, and huge quantities of ammunition. That means they've got to use roads. And a lot of the roads are not in the best of shape. They have to use hard surface roads because anything else is now a mud pit. Because we've moved into this famous mud season where if you drive off an asphalt or concrete road, you sink 10 feet into the mud right away.
So this is a logistical bottleneck, kind of, would you say?
This is a strike to effectively destroy the logistical resupply system and also to put an end to any energy infrastructure, anything that produces electricity. And I think they've had enormous success with this. Now, there's no follow-up in terms of attacks on the ground per se, for the same reason that the Ukrainians are now going to find it very difficult to resupply anybody. Mud. How do you attack in the middle of the mud season on the ground? You really can't. So we're not expecting any sort of ground offensive until probably late April, because it takes 2 months or more for the ground to dry out to support any vehicular traffic. But in the meantime, this makes it very, very hard for the Ukrainians to resupply their troops in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah. I'm seeing that story from Radio Free Europe says Russia launches more deadly airstrikes on Ukrainian cities. Power to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant restored after cutoff. Those nuclear power plants are always kind of a tricky situation, right? Because they always acting like that could be the situation for a new Chernobyl. How close are we to that type of thing happening from?
Well, the Russians have very carefully and deliberately avoided exploding any ordnance near any nuclear power plant. And the few that have fallen into their hands, they've maintained security around them and prevented them from being damaged. So I would say that unless the Ukrainians go after one of their own power plants that is under their control, there will be no trouble with nuclear power. The problem with a nuclear meltdown, as I'm sure you know, David, and all your listeners know, it's not a weapon that you can direct. It harms everyone. This is also the problem with lots of your chemical and biological weapons. Those things don't discriminate. And everything depends on weather as well. So the bottom line is, I don't think you're going to see anything like that happen in this war right now. Absolutely not.
You see, reports. I had a talk with Larry Johnson earlier this week, and he was talking about how the Bakhmut narrative has flipped. It was said to be a very strategically important city in the media, in the Western media, and now they've changed to say it's not that big of a deal now that it looks like it's pretty much encircled by Russian forces. What's the truth about Bakhmut? I'm hearing that some of the soldiers in Ukraine are, kind of having a lot of weariness about continuing to try to hold their positions in Bakhmut.
Well, Bakhmut has turned into a major bloodbath. We now think we're up over 200,000 Ukrainian dead, and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have died in this town of Bakhmut. And Larry Johnson's right. Everyone said that this was terribly important for months, and then suddenly said, "Well, this is not that big a deal." In truth, it's a very important city. Understanding once again the terrain and the fact that at least for months at a time you are limited to road travel. The road network in and around Bakhmut is enormously important, and it leads also to railheads, which means that it's a logistical hub. And once this falls, it's going to be very difficult for the rest of the defensive network that runs for hundreds of miles across southern Ukraine to hold together. The other thing is that Zelensky has been moving troops that had been set aside for use in the future as counterattack forces and taken them and thrown them into the Bakhmut bloodbath. With the result, they've taken far, far more casualties. Remember, Bakhmut is the centerpiece for what I would call this World War I style engagement. It's almost like Verdun, where you have tens of thousands of troops on both sides, and the group on one side has more artillery than the other. I mean, for every one gun the Ukrainians have, the Russians have at least 10. And in the case of Bakhmut of the last couple of weeks, the Ukrainians have simply run out of both guns and ammunition, so they haven't been able to support their troops. Without friendly artillery support, they're simply being destroyed, ground into bits. And many, many Ukrainian soldiers are saying, "This is it. We can't survive this. We've got to get out of here." And even though Zelensky's generals have urged him repeatedly, pull the troops out because we'll need them to fight again down the line, he has refused to do so. Now I think Ukrainian soldiers in numbers, who knows how many, are simply falling back on their own, hoping to survive and escape the what they call the cauldron that's being created inside Bakhmut. I don't know how many there are there right now. They're probably no longer 10,000. It's probably less than that, probably between 5 and 10. And the only way for them to escape is across open fields and through woods, which there are plenty of in and around Bakhmut. How many will ultimately reach their own lines, I have no idea, but all the equipment that is there will be abandoned, and eventually it'll essentially be deserted. And it's pretty close to that at this point, but there are still some hanging on. And we've been reading for weeks now reports of Ukrainian soldiers saying, "Look, we're being hung out to dry. We're not getting food, we're not getting ammunition, we're not being supported with any artillery, and it's hard to evacuate our wounded. Too many men are bleeding to death." It's a horror story on the World War I scale. And so I think the Bakhmut story is about to end. And that's the beginning of a new phase in this war, where the southern defenses completely crumble. And then we begin to inch forward on the Russian side incrementally along the roads. But we're not going to see the major breakout that we've been expecting now, certainly since late December, early January, until the mud dries out. So there will be no sudden breakthrough and sweeping advances until late April, May, or June.
Wow. I mean, that is something that does not bode well for the success of what we are told. I mean, it's just so completely opposite from everything we hear, that the Russians are running out of ammo, the Russians are depleted their resources, but you're suggesting it's the opposite, that the Ukrainian situation isn't looking very good for their long-term survival in this conflict, right?
Well, no, I don't. Listen, I don't think it ever has. I think what's worked well is the individual courage, strength, and endurance of the Ukrainian soldier. We know historically the Ukrainians have always been good fighters. They didn't have to go to war to prove it, but they've proven it once again. The problem is, for what? What are they fighting for at this point? Virtually everything of any value in Ukraine is under Russian control. In other words, this is similar to an enemy that came into the United States and controlled the entire East Coast and then sat there. That's what the Russians have done. In other words, they captured the scientific industrial base, the coal mines, the iron ore, the rare earths, the natural gas, the oil, everything. They're sitting on it. And that's not surprising because the people that live in those areas are overwhelmingly Russians. And they speak Russian, so they're very happy to have the Russians there. But having captured that, Ukraine is left with a large agrarian sector, but almost nothing else, which means it now depends very heavily on anything that we manufacture or the Europeans manufacture. And the Europeans are effectively out of gear. They've sent most of what they have to send. The German defense minister recently said Germany really can't afford to send any more than it already has and what is promised, because if we do, we'll be defenseless. You know, I mentioned the other day to someone that people don't realize just how bad things are in NATO. The Polish army today could probably conquer Germany in a week because the Germans just have no military power to speak of to stop them. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think that gives everybody an appreciation for just how weak Germany is. Germany has prospered with all this cheap natural gas and oil from Russia for decades, but it has also neglected its own military establishment to the point where it's almost defenseless. When you switch to France, as a good friend of mine who's a retired general in the French army says repeatedly, Douglas, the only thing the French army is prepared to do is go on safari in North Africa. In other words, the rest of the force is designed for all of this low-intensity conflict nonsense that we've been wasting time on for the past 25 or 30 years, ever since Desert Storm. So the bottom line is, yes, the Ukrainians are in a very, very bad situation. It's not going to improve dramatically, but they're going to dig in subsequent locations and try to defend against what is coming in the spring. But I don't think we're going to see much in the way of a major Ukrainian counterattack. They were talking about a counteroffensive in the springtime. I don't think we're going to see much of that. We may see some localized attacks, but not much more.